The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red uniform one final time. After 15 years of dedicated service to the Crown, he had earned his position as head of the Royal Guard through unwavering loyalty and exceptional duty. His polished boots clicked against the ancient stone floors as he made his way to his post, unaware that this particular Tuesday would change his life forever. James had always taken pride in his role. Born in a small village in Yorkshire, he came from a family with deep military traditions. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father had been a career soldier, and James had followed in their footsteps with honor. The Royal Guard represented the pinnacle of his career, a position that demanded absolute precision, discretion, and respect for the royal family. The castle was bustling with its usual morning activities. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast, groundskeepers tended to the immaculate gardens, and various officials moved through the corridors conducting royal business. James had witnessed countless such mornings, each one requiring his vigilant attention to security protocols and royal etiquette. Queen Camilla had recently taken on more prominent duties following her husband's coronation. The transition had brought new dynamics to the royal household, and everyone was still adjusting to the changes. Some staff members whispered about her different approach to royal traditions, though James had always maintained his professional distance from palace gossip. On this particular morning, James noticed unusual activity near the Queen's private quarters. Several new staff members had been hired recently, and there seemed to be some reorganization of duties taking place. He had heard rumors about modernization efforts and streamlining of certain protocols, but nothing that would directly affect his responsibilities. As he took his position at the main entrance, James reviewed the day's schedule in his mind. There were no major events planned, just routine meetings and administrative duties. The Queen was expected to receive several visitors throughout the day, including charity representatives and government officials. Security had been briefed on all expected arrivals, and everything seemed straightforward. The first sign that something was different came around mid-morning. James noticed one of the Queen's private secretaries, Mrs. Hartford, approaching with an unusually serious expression. She had worked at the palace for over 20 years and was known for her calm demeanor and professional efficiency. Her troubled look immediately caught James's attention. Mrs. Hartford paused near James's post, glancing around nervously before speaking in hushed tones. She mentioned that there had been some unusual requests from the Queen's office regarding security arrangements. Apparently, there were discussions about making changes to the guard rotation and possibly reassigning certain personnel. James listened carefully, though such administrative matters were typically handled through proper channels. Throughout his career, James had served under different monarchs and had adapted to various changes in protocol and procedure. He understood that each member of the royal family had their own preferences and ways of conducting business. However, he had always been kept informed of any changes that might affect his duties or the security arrangements he was responsible for maintaining. As the morning progressed, James noticed several meetings taking place in the administrative offices. Senior staff members seemed to be having intense discussions, and there was an atmosphere of tension that was unusual for the normally well-organized royal household. He continued his duties professionally, but couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was developing. The Queen's schedule appeared to be running smoothly, with her morning appointments proceeding as planned. James had brief glimpses of her during visitor arrivals and departures, and she seemed to be conducting her duties with her usual grace and composure. Yet the undercurrent of activity among the staff suggested that important decisions were being made behind the scenes. James had always prided himself on being observant and intuitive about potential security concerns. His experience had taught him to pay attention to subtle changes in routine and atmosphere. While nothing seemed immediately threatening, the unusual level of administrative activity was enough to keep him alert and focused. During his lunch break, James spoke briefly with some of his fellow guards. Several mentioned that they had noticed the increased activity around the administrative offices as well. There were rumors about budget reviews and efficiency evaluations, though no official communications had been sent to the security staff about any impending changes. The afternoon brought a series of meetings that seemed to involve various department heads and senior staff members. James observed several people he didn't immediately recognize entering and leaving the castle, suggesting that external consultants or advisors might be involved in whatever discussions were taking place. This was not entirely unusual, as the royal household periodically reviewed its operations and procedures. As his shift continued, James maintained his professional focus while remaining aware of the evolving situation around him. His years of experience had taught him the importance of staying prepared for unexpected developments while continuing to perform his duties to the highest standard. The safety and security of the royal family always remained his top priority, regardless of any administrative changes that might be occurring. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the courtyard when James received word that his presence was requested in the main administrative office. This was unusual, as routine communications typically went through his immediate supervisor. The formal nature of the request suggested that whatever was happening was about to directly involve him. As James made his way through the familiar corridors toward the administrative wing, he reflected on his years of service and the various challenges he had faced throughout his career. He had always approached his duties with dedication and professionalism, earning the respect of his colleagues and superiors. Whatever lay ahead, he was confident in his record of service and his commitment to upholding the highest standards of the Royal Guard. The administrative office was busier than usual, with several staff members working at their desks and others engaged in quiet conversations. James reported to the reception area and was asked to wait while the necessary personnel were assembled for what appeared to be an important meeting. The atmosphere was formal and serious, suggesting that significant matters were about to be discussed. The administrative office felt different than James had ever experienced it before. The usual warm atmosphere had been replaced by something much more formal and cold. Mrs. Hartford sat behind her mahogany desk, her fingers nervously shuffling through a stack of official documents. Beside her stood Mr. Pemberton, the palace's chief administrative officer, a man James had only seen from a distance during ceremonial occasions. James stood at attention, his military training automatically taking over despite the unusual circumstances. Years of discipline had taught him to maintain composure regardless of the situation, though he couldn't deny the growing sense of unease settling in his chest. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Mrs. Hartford finally cleared her throat. She began by acknowledging James's long and distinguished service to the crown. Her words were carefully chosen and delivered in the practiced tone of someone who had clearly rehearsed this conversation multiple times. She spoke of his dedication, his professionalism, and his unwavering loyalty over the past 15 years. However, James could sense an underlying tension in her voice that suggested this praise was leading somewhere he might not like. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Hartford mentioned that the royal household was undergoing a comprehensive review of its operations. She explained that Queen Camilla had personally requested an evaluation of all security arrangements and staff assignments as part of her commitment to modernizing the monarchy and ensuring the most efficient use of resources. James listened carefully as the administrative officer outlined various changes that were being considered or had already been implemented. Some positions were being consolidated, certain protocols were being updated, and there was a general push toward what they called streamlined operations. The language was corporate and bureaucratic, quite different from the traditional royal terminology James was accustomed to hearing. As the explanation continued, James began to understand that these changes weren't merely administrative adjustments. The Queen had apparently expressed specific concerns about certain aspects of the current security arrangements. There were mentions of outdated practices, redundant positions, and the need for fresh perspectives in the royal protection services. Mrs. Hartford paused to consult her documents before delivering the news that James had begun to suspect was coming. She explained that as part of this comprehensive review, certain personnel changes were deemed necessary. The Queen had specifically requested that some long-serving guards be reassigned to different duties or encouraged to consider early retirement packages. The words hit James like a physical blow, though his military training kept his expression neutral. After 15 years of exemplary service, during which he had never received a single complaint or negative evaluation, he was being told that his position was no longer required. The irony wasn't lost on him that his dedication and experience were apparently being viewed as liabilities rather than assets. Mr. Pemberton stepped forward to provide additional details about the decision. He spoke in measured tones about the Queen's vision for a more modern and efficient royal household. According to him, Queen Camilla believed that some of the traditional approaches to security and protocol were no longer suitable for contemporary needs. She wanted guards who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances and embrace new methodologies. James found himself wondering what specific incident or concern had prompted this dramatic overhaul. Throughout his tenure, he had witnessed various security challenges and had always responded with the professionalism and competence that his training had instilled in him. He had protected members of the royal family during public events, private gatherings, and international visits without incident. The administrative officers continued their explanation, detailing the specific changes that would affect James personally. He was being offered what they called a voluntary resignation, with a generous severance package and glowing references for future employment. The alternative, they implied without stating directly, would be a formal dismissal that might not look as favorable on his service record. As James processed this information, he couldn't help but think about the younger guards who would presumably be taking over his responsibilities. Many of them were capable and well-trained, but they lacked the experience and institutional knowledge that came with years of service. He wondered how the Queen had come to the conclusion that inexperience was preferable to expertise. Mrs. Hartford seemed uncomfortable as she delivered the timeline for his departure. The decision was to be implemented immediately, meaning that James would need to clear out his personal belongings and complete his final duties within the next few days. There would be no gradual transition period or opportunity to train his replacement in the nuances of his specific responsibilities. The meeting continued with discussions about confidentiality, agreements, and the importance of maintaining discretion about the circumstances of his departure. James was reminded that his years of service had given him access to sensitive information about royal security procedures, and there were expectations about how he would conduct himself in his post-royal career. Throughout this conversation, James maintained his professional composure, though internally he was struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. The life he had built around his service to the crown was being dismantled with the efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Years of dedication and sacrifice were being reduced to administrative paperwork and severance calculations. As the meeting drew to a close, James was given a folder containing all the relevant documents related to his departure. The papers included details about his severance package, information about transferring his pension benefits, and various forms that needed to be completed and returned within specified timeframes. The bureaucratic nature of it all stood in stark contrast to the ceremonial dignity he had always associated with royal service. Mr. Pemberton concluded by expressing appreciation for James's years of service and wishing him well in his future endeavors. The words felt hollow and scripted, lacking any genuine warmth or recognition of the personal impact this decision was having on someone who had devoted the best years of his career to protecting the royal family. James accepted the folder with the same military bearing he had maintained throughout the meeting, though his mind was racing with questions and emotions he couldn't yet fully process. As he prepared to leave the office, he realized that his entire identity and sense of purpose were being fundamentally challenged by this unexpected turn of events. The weight of the folder in James's hands felt heavier than any equipment he had ever carried during his military service. As he walked through the corridors of Windsor Castle, each step echoed with 15 years of memories and dedication that now seemed to count for nothing. The familiar surroundings that had once filled him with pride now felt foreign and unwelcoming. James made his way to the guards' quarters, where he would need to begin the process of packing his personal belongings. The small room had been his second home for years, containing mementos from various royal events, commendations for exceptional service, and photographs with fellow guards who had become like family to him. Now it all had to be reduced to a few boxes and carried away as if his presence had never mattered. As he began sorting through his possessions, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the entire situation. The explanation given by Mrs. Hartford and Mr. Pemberton had been professional and thorough, but it lacked the ring of complete truth. In his experience, major security changes were usually preceded by specific incidents or credible threats, not vague references to modernization and efficiency. The more James thought about it, the more questions arose in his mind. Why had Queen Camilla specifically requested changes to the guard personnel without consulting the security chiefs who had years of experience in royal protection? Why were experienced guards being replaced with less seasoned personnel during a time when global security concerns were actually increasing? And why was the entire process being handled with such unusual haste and secrecy? His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Corporal Davies, one of his closest colleagues and a guard who had served under James's supervision for the past 8 years. Davies entered the room with obvious concern written across his face, having heard rumors about what had transpired in the administrative office. The younger guard had always looked up to James as a mentor and role model. Davies expressed his shock and disbelief at the news, echoing many of the same questions that were troubling James. He mentioned that several other guards were equally confused by the sudden changes, especially given that there had been no apparent problems with security or performance. The morale among the remaining guards was already beginning to suffer as word of the dismissals spread throughout the castle. As they talked, James learned that he wasn't the only experienced guard being dismissed. 3 other senior personnel had received similar treatment, all of them with exemplary service records and years of dedication to the crown. The pattern suggested a systematic removal of the most experienced members of the security team, which made even less sense from a practical standpoint. James found himself thinking about the various members of the royal family he had protected over the years. He had been present during some of their most vulnerable moments and had earned their trust through his professionalism and discretion. It was difficult to believe that any of them would have requested his removal without cause, particularly given the positive relationships he had maintained with the household staff and royal family members. Corporal Davies mentioned something that caught James's attention. He had overheard a conversation between 2 of the newer administrative staff members, suggesting that the security changes were part of a larger reorganization that went beyond simple modernization. There were hints that Queen Camilla was bringing in her own preferred personnel and establishing new protocols that differed significantly from long-standing traditions. This information prompted James to consider the possibility that his dismissal might not be about his performance or competence at all. Instead, it might be connected to broader political or personal dynamics within the royal household that he wasn't privy to. The thought was both troubling and somewhat relieving, as it suggested that his years of service hadn't been judged inadequate. As the day progressed, James received visits from several other guards and staff members who had heard about his situation. Many expressed their support and disbelief, sharing stories about how James had helped them during difficult times or had gone above and beyond in his duties. The outpouring of solidarity was both heartwarming and heartbreaking, as it reinforced how much his presence had meant to the people he worked with. One particularly meaningful conversation came from Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper who had worked at the castle for over 30 years. She had witnessed many changes in royal personnel over the decades and had developed a keen insight into the dynamics of palace life. Her perspective on the current situation was both enlightening and concerning. Mrs. Thompson suggested that the recent changes reflected a fundamental shift in how Queen Camilla viewed the role of traditional staff members. According to her observations, the Queen seemed to prefer surrounding herself with people who had no previous loyalties or connections to the royal household. This approach might provide her with more control and flexibility, but it also eliminated the institutional knowledge and experience that long-serving staff members provided. The housekeeper's insights helped James understand that his dismissal might be part of a larger strategy, rather than a personal judgment about his capabilities. While this knowledge didn't make the situation any less painful, it did provide some context for what had happened and why it had been handled in such an abrupt manner. As evening approached, James continued packing his belongings while reflecting on the unexpected turn his life had taken. The military training that had served him so well throughout his career now helped him maintain focus and composure, despite the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. He knew that dwelling on anger or resentment would not serve any productive purpose. However, James also recognized that he had rights and options that he hadn't yet fully explored. His dismissal had been presented as a voluntary resignation, but the circumstances suggested that there might be grounds for challenging the decision through proper channels. His service record was exemplary, and there had been no formal disciplinary actions or performance issues that would justify such drastic action. The thought of fighting the dismissal raised complex considerations about loyalty, professional reputation, and future career prospects. James had always prided himself on his discretion and loyalty to the crown, but he also had to consider his own interests and the principles of fair treatment that should apply to all employees, regardless of their position. As he prepared for what might be his final night in the guards' quarters, James knew that he faced a crucial decision about how to respond to this unexpected challenge. The choice he made would not only affect his own future, but might also set a precedent for how other long-serving staff members could be treated in the evolving royal household. The sleepless night gave James ample time to process everything that had happened and consider his options carefully. As dawn broke over Windsor Castle, he had reached a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than quietly accepting the dismissal and fading into obscurity, James decided that he had both the right and the responsibility to seek a proper explanation for what had occurred. His military background had instilled in him a strong sense of justice and proper procedure. Throughout his career, he had witnessed how important it was to follow established protocols and ensure that decisions affecting personnel were made fairly and transparently. The hastily arranged meeting with Mrs. Hartford and Mr. Pemberton had violated many of the principles he believed should govern any professional organization, especially one as prestigious as the royal household. James's first step was to request a meeting with Colonel Hartwell, the head of royal security, who technically held authority over all guard personnel. If there were legitimate security concerns or performance issues that had prompted his dismissal, Colonel Hartwell would be the appropriate person to address them. More importantly, the colonel had the authority to review personnel decisions and ensure they were made according to proper procedures. The request for a meeting was submitted through official channels, but James received word that Colonel Hartwell was unavailable for several days due to other commitments. This delay seemed suspicious, given that personnel matters typically received immediate attention when they involved senior guards. James began to suspect that the colonel might not have been fully informed about the recent dismissals, or worse, that he had been deliberately excluded from the decision-making process. While waiting for the meeting with Colonel Hartwell, James decided to document everything he could remember about his dismissal and the circumstances surrounding it. His military training had taught him the importance of maintaining detailed records, especially when dealing with situations that might require formal review or investigation. He wrote down every conversation, every person involved, and every detail that might be relevant to understanding what had really happened. During this process, James discovered several inconsistencies in the explanations he had been given. The timeline for the security review didn't align with other information he had gathered, and some of the stated reasons for change contradicted established security protocols that had been developed over decades of experience. These discrepancies strengthened his conviction that there was more to the story than he had been told. James also reached out to his union representative, something he had never needed to do throughout his career but now seemed essential. The union had procedures for handling unfair dismissals and could provide both legal advice and representation if formal action became necessary. The representative was shocked by the circumstances of James's dismissal and immediately recognized several potential violations of employment law and union agreements. The union representative explained that James had rights under both employment legislation and specific agreements that covered royal household staff. His dismissal, while presented as voluntary, had many characteristics of wrongful termination, especially given the lack of proper notice, consultation, or documented performance issues. There were also questions about whether the appropriate procedures had been followed for making such significant changes to security personnel. As James delved deeper into the situation, he discovered that the other dismissed guards were equally confused and concerned about what had happened to them. They had all received similar treatment, with identical explanations about modernization and efficiency. This pattern suggested a coordinated effort, rather than individual personnel decisions based on specific circumstances or performance issues. One of the dismissed guards, Sergeant Williams, had already consulted with a legal expert who specialized in employment law. The lawyer had identified several potential grounds for challenging the dismissals, including failure to follow proper procedures, lack of consultation with relevant authorities, and possible discrimination based on age and experience. The legal assessment suggested that the dismissed guards had strong cases if they decided to pursue formal action. James found himself in the unusual position of considering legal action against the institution he had served so faithfully for 15 years. The decision was emotionally difficult, as it went against his natural inclination to maintain loyalty and discretion. However, he also recognized that accepting unfair treatment would set a dangerous precedent for other staff members and potentially compromise the integrity of the royal household itself. The breakthrough in James's understanding came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper who had expressed her support earlier, approached him with additional information she had gathered through her extensive network of contacts within the castle. Her revelations painted a picture that was even more troubling than James had initially suspected. According to Mrs. Thompson's sources, Queen Camilla had indeed specifically requested the removal of certain guards, but not for reasons related to security or efficiency. Instead, the dismissals were connected to her desire to eliminate staff members who might have loyalties to the previous administration, or who possessed detailed knowledge of royal family dynamics that she preferred to keep confidential. The housekeeper explained that several of the dismissed guards had been present during sensitive moments in the royal family's recent history. They had witnessed conversations, observed interactions, and gained insights that Queen Camilla apparently viewed as potentially problematic. Rather than trust their discretion and professionalism, she had chosen to remove them entirely from their positions. This information transformed James's understanding of his dismissal from a bureaucratic decision to a calculated move designed to protect specific interests within the royal household. The knowledge was both validating and deeply troubling, as it suggested that his years of loyal service were being repaid with suspicion and dismissal rather than trust and respect. Mrs. Thompson also revealed that there was growing concern among long-serving staff members about the direction of the changes being implemented. Many feared that their own positions might be at risk if they possessed knowledge or experience that the Queen viewed as inconvenient. The atmosphere within the castle was becoming increasingly tense as people worried about their job, security, and the future of traditions. They had dedicated their careers to preserving armed. With this new understanding, James realized that his situation was about more than just his individual treatment. The precedent being set could affect dozens of other staff members and potentially undermine the stability and effectiveness of the royal household. His decision about how to respond would have implications far beyond his personal circumstances. The weight of this responsibility added another dimension to James's deliberations about whether to challenge his dismissal formally. He was no longer just fighting for his own reinstatement or compensation, but potentially standing up for principles of fairness and proper treatment that affected the entire royal staff community. The decision had become as much about duty and service as it was about personal justice. James's meeting with Colonel Hartwell finally materialized after several days of delays and rescheduling. The colonel's office, located in the security wing of Windsor Castle, had always been a place James associated with important briefings and professional discussions. Now, as he entered the familiar space, he felt the weight of 15 years of service and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Colonel Hartwell appeared genuinely surprised when James explained the circumstances of his dismissal. The colonel's reaction immediately confirmed James's suspicion that the security chief had not been properly consulted about the personnel changes. This revelation was both validating and concerning, as it suggested that established security protocols were being bypassed in favor of administrative decisions made without proper oversight. The colonel listened intently as James provided a detailed account of his meeting with Mrs. Hartford and Mr. Pemberton, the explanations given for his dismissal, and the information he had subsequently gathered about similar treatment of other experienced guards. With each detail, Colonel Hartwell's expression grew more serious, and he began taking notes on what was clearly becoming a significant concern for him as well. Colonel Hartwell explained that personnel decisions affecting senior security staff were supposed to be made in consultation with his office, particularly when they involved multiple dismissals or significant changes to established procedures. The fact that he had been kept out of the decision-making process was not only inappropriate, but potentially dangerous from a security perspective. Experienced guards possessed institutional knowledge and skills that couldn't be easily replaced. The conversation took an interesting turn when Colonel Hartwell revealed that he had been receiving pressure from various administrative offices to approve personnel changes that he considered unnecessary and potentially harmful to security effectiveness. He had resisted these pressures, believing that security decisions should be made based on professional assessment rather than administrative convenience or political considerations. James learned that his dismissal was part of a broader pattern of changes that were being implemented without proper consultation with the security professionals who understood the implications. The colonel expressed frustration that his expertise and authority were being undermined by administrative personnel who lacked the specialized knowledge needed to make informed security decisions. Colonel Hartwell's support gave James new confidence in his decision to challenge the dismissal. The security chief indicated that he would conduct his own investigation into the circumstances surrounding the personnel changes and would recommend that proper procedures be followed in any future decisions. He also suggested that James's dismissal might be reversed if it could be demonstrated that appropriate protocols had not been followed. However, the colonel also warned James about the political complexities involved in challenging decisions that had apparently been made at very high levels within the royal household. While he supported James's right to fair treatment and proper procedures, he cautioned that the situation might involve considerations beyond simple employment law or security protocols. The royal household operated according to unique customs and hierarchies that sometimes complicated straightforward solutions. Armed with Colonel Hartwell's support and encouragement, James decided to proceed with formal action to challenge his dismissal. His union representative had prepared a comprehensive case that highlighted multiple violations of proper procedure and employment law. The documentation included testimony from other affected guards, evidence of the security chief's lack of consultation, and expert opinions on the potential security risks created by removing experienced personnel. The formal challenge was submitted through the royal household's internal grievance procedures, with copies sent to relevant external authorities who had oversight responsibilities for employment practices. James's military background had taught him the importance of following proper channels while also ensuring that all appropriate parties were informed of the situation. The response from the administrative offices was swift and defensive. James received a formal letter reiterating the original explanation for his dismissal and emphasizing the Queen's prerogative to make personnel decisions as she saw fit. The letter also included subtle warnings about the consequences of pursuing formal action and hints about confidentiality agreements that might be relevant to his situation. Despite these intimidation tactics, James remained committed to seeing the process through to its conclusion. He had invested too much of his life in service to the crown to accept unfair treatment without fighting for proper procedures and respect for the principles he had dedicated his career to upholding. The support from Colonel Hartwell and his fellow guards gave him the strength to persevere, despite the pressure being applied. The situation began to attract attention beyond the confines of Windsor Castle. James's union representative had connections with legal experts who specialized in employment law and public sector governance. These professionals recognized that the case raised important questions about accountability and proper procedure within royal institutions, issues that had broader implications for public administration and worker rights. Media interest began to develop as word of the situation spread through networks of royal watchers and employment law specialists. While James had no interest in publicity and maintained his commitment to discretion, the legal and procedural issues involved, in his case, were significant enough to warrant attention from journalists who covered royal affairs and workplace rights. The growing attention created additional pressure on the royal household to address the situation properly. Administrative officials who had initially dismissed James's concerns as minor grievances began to realize that the case might have more serious implications for the institution's reputation and legal standing. The possibility of negative publicity and legal challenges created incentives for finding a resolution that would satisfy all parties involved. James found himself in the unusual position of having his personal situation become a test case for broader principles of fairness and accountability within royal institutions. While he had never sought such a role, His military training and sense of duty compelled him to see the matter through to its proper conclusion, regardless of the personal costs or benefits that might result. As the formal review process continued, James maintained his professional demeanor and commitment to serving the best interests of the crown. Even while challenging specific decisions that affected him personally, his approach demonstrated that loyalty and accountability were not contradictory concepts, but rather complementary principles that strengthened institutions when properly applied. The support he received from colleagues, legal experts, and security professionals reinforced his conviction that pursuing formal action had been the right decision. Whether the outcome would be favorable remained to be seen, but James knew that he had honored his commitment to proper procedure and fair treatment, values that had guided him throughout his career in service to others. The resolution came in a way that nobody, including James himself, had anticipated. 3 weeks after filing his formal challenge, James received an unexpected call from the private office of King Charles himself. The king's private secretary requested a personal meeting to discuss the situation that had developed around James's dismissal and the broader questions it had raised about personnel procedures within the royal household. The meeting took place in the king's private study, a room James had only seen from a distance during his years of service. King Charles greeted him with a warmth and respect that immediately put James at ease, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. The king's approach demonstrated both his personal involvement in the situation and his commitment to addressing the concerns that had been raised. King Charles began by acknowledging James's years of dedicated service and expressing his personal regret that the situation had developed as it had. He explained that he had only recently become aware of the personnel changes that had affected James and other experienced guards, and that these decisions had been made without his knowledge or approval. The king's words confirmed what James had suspected about the unauthorized nature of his dismissal. The king revealed that Colonel Hartwell had briefed him extensively on the security implications of removing experienced personnel without proper consultation or replacement planning. The security chief had emphasized that the dismissed guards possessed irreplaceable knowledge and skills that were essential for maintaining the safety and security of the royal family. Their removal had created gaps in security coverage that could have serious consequences. More importantly, King Charles expressed concern about the broader implications of the personnel changes for the culture and effectiveness of the royal household. He emphasized his belief that experienced staff members were valuable assets who deserved respect and fair treatment, not obstacles to be removed for administrative convenience. The king's perspective validated everything James had argued throughout his challenge to the dismissal. King Charles also addressed the procedural violations that had occurred during James's dismissal. He acknowledged that proper protocols had not been followed, and that the security chief should have been consulted before any changes were made to guard personnel. The king indicated that steps would be taken to ensure that such violations did not occur again and that established procedures would be respected in all future personnel decisions. The conversation took a personal turn when King Charles asked James about his experiences during his years of service and his observations about the changes that had occurred within the royal household. James spoke honestly about his dedication to protecting the royal family and his concerns about the direction of recent administrative changes. The king listened attentively and asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in understanding the situation from James's perspective. King Charles then made an offer that surprised James completely. Rather than simply reversing his dismissal and returning him to his previous position, the king offered James a promotion to a newly created position as senior security advisor. This role would involve working directly with Colonel Hartwell to review and improve security procedures while also serving as a liaison between experienced staff members in the administrative offices. The new position would recognize James's experience and expertise while also addressing the systemic issues that had led to his dismissal. As senior security advisor, James would have the authority to ensure that proper procedures were followed in all personnel decisions affecting security staff. He would also be responsible for developing training programs that would preserve and transfer the institutional knowledge possessed by experienced guards. James was initially overwhelmed by the unexpected nature of the king's offer. The promotion represented not only vindication of his challenge to the dismissal, but also recognition of his value and potential contributions to the royal household. More importantly, it provided an opportunity to help prevent other staff members from experiencing the unfair treatment he had endured. The king explained that the new position reflected his commitment to balancing necessary modernization with respect for tradition and experience. He emphasized that change should be implemented thoughtfully and with proper consultation, not through arbitrary decisions that disregarded established expertise and procedures. James's situation had highlighted the importance of maintaining this balance. King Charles also addressed the broader personnel issues that had affected other dismissed guards. He indicated that their cases would be reviewed individually, and that appropriate remedies would be provided where violations of proper procedure had occurred. The king's commitment to addressing these situations demonstrated his understanding that the problems extended beyond James's individual case. The meeting concluded with King Charles expressing his appreciation for James's willingness to stand up for proper procedures and fair treatment, even when doing so required challenging powerful interests within the royal household. The king characterized James's actions as exemplifying the best traditions of service and loyalty, qualities that strengthened rather than threatened the institution he had dedicated his career to protecting. James accepted the promotion with gratitude and renewed commitment to serving the crown. His new role would allow him to contribute to positive changes within the royal household, while also ensuring that other staff members received the respect and fair treatment they deserved. The outcome exceeded anything he had hoped for when he first decided to challenge his dismissal. The resolution of James's case sent a clear message throughout the royal household about the importance of following proper procedures and respecting experienced staff members. The changes implemented as a result of his challenge created new safeguards against arbitrary personnel decisions and established mechanisms for ensuring that security expertise was properly consulted in all relevant decisions. In his new role as senior security advisor, James worked to rebuild the trust and morale that had been damaged by the recent personnel changes. He developed new training programs, improved communication between different departments, and created procedures that balanced the need for modernization with respect for institutional knowledge and experience. The incident ultimately strengthened the royal household by highlighting the importance of proper procedures and fair treatment for all staff members. James's willingness to challenge unfair treatment, combined with King Charles's commitment to addressing the underlying problems, created positive changes that benefited everyone who worked within the royal household. His reaction to Queen Camilla's order had not only vindicated his own position, but had also helped ensure that future personnel decisions would be made with greater care and respect for all involved.